A $1 million lakefront dream home destroyed in a suspicious blaze. A homeowners association president standing before the smoldering ruins, clipboard in hand, claiming it was just enforcing community standards. And the moment she realizes the man in the sheriff's uniform is the son of the homeowner she's been targeting for months. Some lines should never be crossed. For 30 years, Mike Jennings had served Lakeview County with unwavering dedication. From rookie deputy to county sheriff, he'd built a reputation for fairness and integrity that made him a respected figure in the community. I've seen this county transform from a quiet rural retreat to a sought-after destination. Lakes that once had simple fishing cabins now host $1 million properties. But no matter how fancy the houses got, I always believed good neighbors were what made a community strong. Mike's father, Robert Jennings, was a self-made man who had worked his entire life for one dream: retirement on the shores of Clearwater Lake. At 72, after decades of running his construction business, Robert had finally broken ground on his dream home 3 years ago. Dad designed every inch of that house himself, his first after building homes for hundreds of families. The 3,800-square-foot timber and stone masterpiece took nearly 3 years to complete, with details like a hand-carved staircase my grandfather had started and Dad finished, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lake like a living painting. But it wasn't just architecture, it was the culmination of a promise he'd made to my mother before she passed. That someday they'd wake up to that view together. He finished it a year after we lost her, and told me he could still feel her presence in every room. Dad put everything into that house, his savings, his craftsmanship, his heart. When he finally moved in last year, I'd never seen him so content. He'd sit on that deck for hours, watching eagles soar over the water, telling me, "Son, this is what 45 years of hard work looks like." 3 months after moving in, Robert suffered a massive heart attack. The prognosis was serious. He needed complex bypass surgery and faced months of rehabilitation. The night before his surgery, Dad squeezed my hand and said, "Take care of my house, son. It's my legacy." I promised him I wouldn't let anything happen to it. With a catch in his voice, Mike adds, a promise that would be tested in ways I never imagined. Robert's house wasn't just any lakefront property. It stood out for its craftsmanship and thoughtful design, characteristics that made it both beautiful and a target. Dad built that house to blend with the natural surroundings. The stone was locally quarried, the timber responsibly harvested from the region. He designed it to withstand the harsh winters and capture the summer breezes off the lake. Other houses in the development were showier, all glass and imported marble, but Dad's place had soul. You could feel the difference the moment you walked in. Patricia once referred to it as rustic, like it was an insult. Dad took it as a compliment. What made the situation even more complicated was that Mike had deliberately kept his relationship to Robert low-key within the Shoreline Estates community. He'd always been careful to separate his personal life from his professional role as sheriff. In a county this size, everyone knows I'm the sheriff. But at the HOA meetings, I was just Robert Jennings' son, not there in any official capacity. Patricia knew my last name was Jennings, but in her obsession with revenge against my father, she never bothered to investigate me further or connect me to the sheriff's department. The Jennings surname is common enough in our county that she didn't make the connection, and oversight her arrogance would soon cause her to regret. Maybe if she had bothered to get to know the community she claimed to be protecting, things would have turned out differently for everyone. Shoreline Estates had begun as a modest lakefront community, but as property values soared, so did expectations. The Homeowners Association, once focused on basic maintenance, had evolved into something more controlling under its newest president. Patricia Winters moved to Shoreline Estates from Chicago about 2 years ago. She was a former corporate executive who'd lost her position in a whistleblowing scandal. The lake community was her fresh start, and she immediately began consolidating power. Within 6 months, she'd managed to get herself elected HOA president by promising a return to traditional values in the community. What most residents didn't know was that my father had testified against Patricia's husband in a construction fraud case 15 years earlier, helping send him to prison. She'd recognized our family name the moment she saw it on the property records. Patricia's ruthless campaign extended beyond my father. She'd targeted several longtime residents, all retirees who'd known each other for decades. One was a retired judge who'd presided over her husband's case, another a former prosecutor. It wasn't coincidence. She was systematically going after everyone connected to her husband's downfall, using the HOA as her weapon. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after Dad's surgery. It cited unauthorized structural modifications and demanded immediate remediation of the accessibility ramp Dad had installed for his recovery. The fine was $500. Dad had specifically designed the ramp to blend with the property's aesthetics, but Patricia claimed it violated historical community standards that didn't actually exist in any bylaws. While Mike visited his father in the hospital, more violations accumulated. Unapproved exterior lighting, improper boat storage, unauthorized dock modifications. Each came with increasing fines and more threatening language. I called Patricia to explain the situation, that my father was recovering from major surgery and would address these issues when he returned home. Her response chilled me to the bone. Rules don't change because someone gets sick. This isn't personal, it's about community standards, she claimed, but there was something in her tone that felt deeply personal. If he can't maintain standards, perhaps Shoreline Estates isn't the right community for him, or anyone associated with him. As Robert's recovery faced complications, the demands from the HOA intensified. Patricia began sending weekly inspection reports, with photographs documenting alleged violations, each accompanied by additional fines. The most ridiculous citation was for unapproved wildlife encouragement, because Dad had installed bird feeders. When I pointed out that several board members had identical feeders, Patricia simply said, "There's our approved models." As a law enforcement officer, I faced a difficult position. Officially intervening could create a conflict of interest accusation that might compromise any future legal case. So I began quietly documenting every incident, consulting with the county attorney about potential harassment charges, and connecting with other targeted residents. I was building a case the right way, methodically and by the book, never imagining that Patricia's vendetta would escalate to arson before I could complete my investigation. By the time Robert was transferred to a rehabilitation facility, the HOA had placed a lien against his property, claiming over $30,000 in unpaid fines and emergency remediation costs. I attended the HOA meeting that month, hoping to reason with the board. I didn't go as Sheriff Jennings. I went as Mike, a son trying to protect his father's interests. I explained Dad's medical situation and asked for reasonable accommodation until he could return home. Patricia didn't just deny the request. She used it as an opportunity to make an example. She projected photos of Dad's property on the wall, calling it the exact kind of neglect that destroys community value. Then she looked me right in the eye and said, "If your father can't maintain his property to our standards, perhaps Shoreline Estates isn't the right community for him." As the meeting ended, Patricia made one final statement that revealed her true motives. She told the board that certain residents were undesirable elements in their traditional community. When another member asked what that meant, Patricia lowered her voice, not realizing I could still hear her, and said, "Some people don't deserve to retire in paradise, especially those who've ruined other families. We can make sure they understand they're not welcome here." It was then I realized this wasn't about rules or appearances. This was deeply personal. The first small victory came unexpectedly. At a town council meeting where Patricia was pushing for stricter HOA enforcement powers, I quietly submitted evidence of how her selective enforcement targeted specific residents with medical issues. Without revealing my connection to my father, I simply presented the facts as the county sheriff concerned about elder protection. The council unanimously rejected her proposal, and the look on her face when her plans crumbled was the first moment of justice in what would become a much larger reckoning. After 3 months of continuous harassment, Mike decided to stay at his father's house for a weekend to address some of the cited issues. He arrived Friday evening to find a certified letter taped to the door. The letter stated that due to continued noncompliance, the HOA was invoking its emergency remediation clause. They would be sending contractors to correct violations the following Monday. with all costs billed to my father at a 150% markup. Mike immediately called Patricia, identifying himself both as Robert's son and as the county sheriff. I want to be clear about this conversation, Patricia. I'm not calling in my official capacity. I'm calling as the legal representative for my father, who's still in medical care. You cannot legally enter this property without proper authorization. Patricia's voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to getting her way. Actually, Sheriff Jennings, if you read Section 12.4 of the Covenant, you'll see that by purchasing in Shoreline Estates, your father granted the association the right of access for maintenance enforcement. We're well within our rights. I've read the covenant cover to cover, Ms. Winters. That clause applies only to common areas and easements, not to private residences. What you're proposing is trespassing. The conversation escalated quickly, with Patricia's tone shifting from professional to personal. Patricia insisted that her interpretation was backed by their attorney. When I offered to have the county legal team review the documents, she became defensive. This is precisely the problem with your father's property, Sheriff. You people think the rules don't apply to you because of your position. Mike's professional training in keeping calm during confrontations was tested like never before. You people? I repeated, making sure I'd heard correctly. Ms. Winters, my father worked his entire life to build that house. He's followed every county code and regulation. The issues you're citing are aesthetic preferences, not safety violations. Patricia's response revealed the true motivation behind her campaign, and she abandoned all pretense of professionalism. This community has standards for a reason, Sheriff, she said, her professional mask slipping. Your father's choices don't align with what Shoreline Estates represents. She paused, then added with barely concealed venom, people who destroy other people's lives don't get to enjoy paradise. That house will conform or it will be gone. Her words carried a weight that went far beyond community guidelines. After the call, Mike installed security cameras around the property, a precaution that would prove invaluable. Something about Patricia's determination worried me. This wasn't just about community standards anymore. When someone becomes fixated on a goal, they sometimes cross lines they shouldn't. That Sunday evening, Mike received a text message from a neighbor. Thought you should know, Patricia was showing someone around your dad's property perimeter today. Guy in an expensive suit taking notes. They were pointing at the house a lot. Patricia's behavior had become increasingly erratic as her campaign against my father and the others dragged on without achieving her desired results. My father was recovering, the other residents were standing firm, and the small victory at the town council had clearly rattled her. In her desperation to finally destroy what my father had built, she was taking risks and making mistakes, the kind of mistakes that someone with her calculated nature would normally avoid. Her need for revenge was clouding her judgment, making her reckless in ways that would ultimately prove her undoing. Despite taking precautions, Mike had to fulfill his official duties at the county commissioners' meeting Monday morning. He arranged for deputies to monitor the property and installed temporary security cameras that would send alerts to his phone. The budget meeting started at 8 a.m. sharp. I was giving my department's annual report when the first alert came through at 8:23. I glanced at my phone and saw 3 unmarked trucks pulling up to Dad's property. Mike continued his presentation, periodically checking the security alerts. At 9:15, his phone buzzed with another notification. The footage showed Patricia arriving in her silver Mercedes SUV, directing workers where to park. The men didn't look like any contractors I'd ever seen. No company logos, no proper equipment. I recognized one of them. He'd been arrested twice for property damage and suspected arson. Mike excused himself from the meeting, citing an emergency, and headed toward his father's property. I was about 10 minutes away when Deputy Harrison called. His voice was tense. Mike, they're pouring something around the foundation. Looks like they're dousing the deck too. This isn't remediation, you need to get here now. As Mike sped toward the property, another call came in, this time from the fire department. A blaze had been reported at his father's address. I hit the lights and siren and pushed the cruiser as hard as I dared. All I could think was, not the house. Please, not the house. I'd made a promise to protect it, and now it might be too late. When Mike arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. The volunteer firefighters had just begun battling the blaze, but the fire had already consumed most of the structure. Mike parked his county sheriff's vehicle at the end of the driveway and stepped out, still in his full uniform. He stood for a moment, hands on his hips, taking in the devastating scene, his father's dream home being destroyed before his eyes. The fire had spread with unnatural speed, clear evidence of accelerants. The timber frame that Dad had selected for its beauty had become the perfect fuel. Standing there in my uniform, watching my father's dream collapse into ash and embers, took everything I had not to break down. All those years of saving, planning, and building, gone in minutes because someone decided his home didn't fit their vision of what the community should look like. Mike's training as a law enforcement officer had taught him to maintain composure in crisis situations. But this was different. This was personal in a way nothing in his 30 years of service had prepared him for. I felt a mix of emotions I'd never experienced before: grief for what my father had lost, guilt that I hadn't been able to protect it as I'd promised, and a cold, simmering anger toward whoever was responsible. As sheriff, I'd always prided myself on separating personal feelings from professional duties. But standing there, watching flames consume my father's legacy, I knew this case would test those boundaries like nothing before. Patricia Winters emerged, a woman in her early 40s dressed in an expensive beige pantsuit, her blonde hair blowing in the wind. Despite being younger than most residents, she'd leveraged her corporate authority and intimidation tactics to seize control of the community. She clutched a tablet to her chest and walked briskly toward the fire chief, not even noticing Mike standing there. "I'm Patricia Winters, Shoreline Estates HOA president," she announced with authority. "I need to document this for our records. We had contractors scheduled today for code enforcement. Were they able to complete their work before this unfortunate incident?" The fire chief looked past Patricia toward Mike, uncertain how to respond. Patricia, following his gaze, turned and finally saw Mike standing there, a man in his 50s in a sheriff's uniform, hands firmly planted on his hips, staring at her with barely contained fury. There was a moment of confusion on her face. She recognized me from the HOA meetings, but seeing me in uniform seemed to short-circuit her brain. Then came the slow dawn of realization. Standing with his hands firmly planted on his hips, Mike locked eyes with Patricia. "Sheriff Jennings," he said, his voice deliberately measured as he took a step toward her, the flames of his father's burning dream home reflected in his badge. "We haven't formally met in this capacity. I'm Robert Jennings' son, the man whose life you've been trying to destroy." The color drained from Patricia's face as the full implications hit her. Her eyes darted between Mike's badge, his stern expression, and the county sheriff's vehicle behind him. "Sheriff, I didn't. This is your father's property." Her composure cracked momentarily, her hand trembling as she lowered her tablet. "How unfortunate. I was just here to document the situation for HOA records." "Yes, Ms. Winters. Very unfortunate timing," Mike replied, still standing with his hands on his hips, his posture projecting both authority and barely contained anger. "I'd like to see the work order for today's contractors, please, and their insurance information. Since you're here officially for the HOA, I assume you have that documentation with you." Several firefighters paused their work to watch the confrontation unfolding, the powerful HOA president suddenly finding herself face-to-face with the county sheriff whose father's home she had just destroyed. The rural lakeside setting, with the house ablaze in the background and the pristine water of the lake reflecting the flames, created a striking tableau of destruction and accountability. Watching Patricia try to regain her composure was like watching someone desperately trying to reassemble a shattered vase. Her professional mask was slipping, revealing the panic underneath. Patricia's hand clutched her tablet tighter. "I'll have to get that from our management company. If you'll excuse me, I should make some calls." "Before you go, Ms. Winters," Mike said, not moving from his confrontational stance, "I should inform you that this property had security cameras installed, and as the fire chief mentioned, The state fire investigator has been called. This is now an active investigation scene, so I'll need your contact information before you leave." As they stood facing each other, with the burning house creating a dramatic backdrop, Patricia increasingly desperate to explain herself and Mike standing firm with his hands on his hips, Deputy Harrison approached them both. "Sheriff, we've detained the 3 men who were working on the property. One of them is already talking, claiming they were paid cash to create an insurance situation. He's saying the HOA president told them the owner wanted to get rid of the house but needed it to look like an accident." Patricia's face went from pale to ashen. "That's a lie. I never—" "Ms. Winters," Mike interrupted. "I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent until your attorney arrives, because as of right now, you're facing some very serious questions." Though personally devastated, Mike knew he needed to recuse himself from directly investigating the fire. His chief deputy, Sarah Martinez, would lead the county's involvement while the state handled the arson investigation. "I called my father that evening. Telling him that his dream home was gone was one of the hardest things I've ever done." His voice, already weakened from his health struggles, became almost inaudible when he asked, "Was anything saved?" The investigation quickly uncovered disturbing evidence. The contractors Patricia had hired weren't licensed in the county or state. Their vehicles were traced to a property management company in a neighboring county that had been cited multiple times for illegal eviction practices. The security footage was damning. It clearly showed the men spreading accelerants around the property. When confronted with this evidence, 2 of the workers quickly turned on their employer, revealing they'd been paid cash to make the property unsalvageable. Phone records showed multiple calls between Patricia and the leader of the crew in the days leading up to the fire. Even more damning, her bank records revealed a withdrawal of $5,000 the day before the incident, matching exactly the amount the workers claimed to have been paid. What really exposed the extent of Patricia's vendetta was what we found in her home office. She had kept detailed notes on her campaign against my father's property, including a timeline that chillingly listed final resolution on the exact date of the fire. But the most damning evidence was a framed newspaper clipping about her husband's conviction, with my father's testimony highlighted. Beside it lay a handwritten list titled "Those Who Will Pay," with my father's name at the top, followed by the judge, prosecutor, and other witnesses, all residents she had been targeting. Her meticulous planning and deep-seated resentment were laid bare in those documents, transforming what might have appeared as an HOA dispute into what it truly was: a years-long plot for revenge. The investigation uncovered how Patricia had manipulated developer Marcus Cunningham into a partnership. Emails revealed that while she presented their scheme as strategic devaluation to acquire prime properties, her personal communications showed a different agenda. In one email to her sister, she wrote, "Cunningham thinks this is about money. He has no idea this is about justice. Robert Jennings and his friends destroyed Frank's life with their testimony. And now I'm going to take everything from them, starting with that precious house." She had effectively used Cunningham's greed to fund her vendetta. Dad's property was particularly valuable because it had one of the few grandfathered boat docks that extended further into the lake than current regulations allowed. New construction would be limited to smaller docks, but if they acquired his property with the existing dock, they could maintain that valuable feature. The investigation also revealed Patricia's particular animosity toward Robert Jennings specifically. In her private emails with Cunningham, she referred to my father as the old-timer who doesn't understand modern standards and an obstacle to progress. She seemed personally offended by Dad's refusal to conform to her vision. One message was particularly revealing. "He built the house himself, so he thinks that makes him special. Nobody's special enough to hold back our plans. If he won't sell, we'll make him so miserable he'll beg to leave." It was vindictive in a way that went beyond business. It had become a personal crusade for her. What Patricia could never have anticipated was that her target wasn't just any retired builder, but the father of the county sheriff, someone with both the authority and resources to ensure justice would be served. The title to the property was in Robert's name alone, and Mike had never mentioned their relationship during HOA meetings, creating the perfect storm for Patricia's spectacular miscalculation. As the investigation proceeded, Patricia attempted to distance herself from the fire, claiming the contractors had acted without her knowledge. Her story unraveled when investigators found text messages explicitly instructing the crew to make sure nothing remains salvageable. The district attorney was unequivocal about the strength of the case. This isn't just arson, it's a pattern of organized criminal activity designed to defraud homeowners of their property. We're looking at racketeering charges on top of the arson and conspiracy counts. 3 weeks after the fire, Patricia Winters was arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy, arson, fraud, and a host of lesser charges. The contractors faced their own charges, though 2 received reduced sentences for cooperating with prosecutors. The arraignment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I took the day off and sat in the courtroom in civilian clothes. I wanted to be there as Robert's son, not as the sheriff. Dad insisted on attending too, despite his health. "I need to look her in the eye," he said. Patricia's confident demeanor had evaporated. She entered the courtroom looking like a different person, her designer clothes replaced by conservative business attire, her commanding presence diminished by the gravity of her situation. When the judge asked how she pleaded, Patricia's voice was barely audible. Not guilty. The evidence against her was so overwhelming that even her own attorney looked uncomfortable with the plea. The judge set bail at $500,000 and ordered Patricia to surrender her passport. As she left the courtroom, she locked eyes with Mike for a moment. There was no remorse in that look, only calculation. Even then, facing serious prison time, she was still evaluating how to turn the situation to her advantage. My father reached over and put his hand on mine. "Son," he whispered, "that woman has never built anything in her life. All she knows is how to destroy." The criminal case was just the beginning. The county prosecutor launched an investigation into the HOA's financial practices under Patricia's leadership, uncovering misappropriated funds and fraudulent accounting. It turned out that Patricia had been using the HOA's emergency remediation fund as a personal enforcement tool. She had collected over $200,000 in fines during her 18 months as president, much of which had been channeled into community enhancement consultations with a company she controlled through a family member. Civil lawsuits soon followed. Robert filed a case seeking damages for the destruction of his property. The retired judge and former prosecutor whom Patricia had also targeted joined the lawsuit, bringing forward damning evidence of her systematic harassment. 3 additional homeowners came forward with similar claims. During depositions, it emerged that every plaintiff had some connection to her husband's fraud case, witnesses, investigators, or family members of those impacted by the fraud. The pattern was undeniable. This had never been about property values. It was a calculated campaign of revenge. My father may have been hospitalized, but his mind was sharp as ever. He insisted on being present for every meeting with the attorneys. "I built that house to last generations," he told them. "What was destroyed wasn't just wood and stone, it was my life's work." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses. Robert Jennings testified from his wheelchair, his voice gaining strength as he described watching his life's work reduced to ashes. When asked why he thought his home had been targeted, Dad looked directly at Patricia and said, "Because it represented something she could never understand, that a house isn't about status or property values. It's about creating something meaningful that lasts." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Patricia finally spoke. She stood, perfectly composed, and said, "I was attempting to protect the community's interests as I understood them. My methods may have been misguided, but my intentions were to preserve property values for all homeowners." The judge was unimpressed. "Ms. Winters, burning down a man's home while he recovers from heart surgery is not protecting any community I want to be part of. You weaponized rules meant to maintain a neighborhood and used them to terrorize the very people you claim to represent. This court sentences you to 18 years, with no possibility of parole for at least 12. As Patricia was led away, my father turned to me and said, "Now we rebuild, not just the house, but the community too." 6 months after the fire, Robert was finally well enough to visit the property. Mike drove him to the lakefront, where only the stone chimney and foundation remained. Dad sat in his wheelchair for a long time, just looking at the empty space where his dream had been. Then he surprised me by smiling. "You know what, son? We can build it again. Better this time. They may have taken the house, but they didn't take the knowledge, the skills, or the dream. Those are fireproof." The insurance investigation had concluded that the HOA had no legal authority to enter the property, making the fire an act of criminal trespass and arson. The settlement covered the full replacement value, while the civil suit against Patricia, Cunningham, and the HOA's insurance provided additional funds. Dad worked with an architect to redesign the house, keeping the elements he loved most while adding features he'd wished for in the original. The new plans included a dedicated space for my mother's art studio, something Dad had always wanted to give her before she passed. The rebuilding process brought unexpected healing to both Robert and the community. Neighbors pitched in with site preparation, local craftsmen offered their services at reduced rates, and even county officials expedited the permitting process. The most surprising help came from 3 former HOA board members. They personally volunteered to clear debris, admitting they'd been intimidated by Patricia but were too afraid of property devaluation to oppose her. "We forgot what matters," one told my father. "A community isn't about property values. It's about people valuing each other." As construction progressed, the Shoreline Estates HOA underwent a complete reorganization. New bylaws required transparency in all enforcement actions, established an appeals process for violations, and created term limits for board members. For Mike, the case prompted a departmental review of how HOA disputes were handled throughout the county. He established a dedicated mediation service to address conflicts before they escalated to property damage or violence. As a sheriff, I'd seen plenty of neighbor disputes turn ugly, but this experience taught me how vulnerable homeowners can be to abuse of power when it hides behind legal-sounding documents and community regulations. We needed to do better. The case also led to significant legislative changes at the state level. One state representative introduced legislation establishing reasonable accommodation requirements for homeowners facing medical hardships. They informally called it Robert's Law, though by the time it passed, the official name was the Homeowner Protection Act. 18 months after the fire, Robert Jennings moved into his new home. The timber and stone structure echoed the original design but incorporated spaces for family gatherings and extra bedrooms for grandchildren. The day Dad moved in, I took the afternoon off. We sat on his new deck overlooking the lake, drinking coffee in comfortable silence. Finally, he said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes you have to lose something to appreciate what really matters. I lost a house but gained a community. That's a trade I can live with." Robert's health had improved significantly during the rebuilding process. His doctors attributed his recovery partly to the sense of purpose the project had given him. Dad had spent his life building homes for other people. Rebuilding his own gave him a reason to keep fighting when his health was at its lowest. There's a powerful medicine in having something to look forward to. The story of what happened at Shoreline Estates spread throughout the county and beyond. Local news covered the case extensively, and several regional outlets picked up the story of the HOA president who burned down a house without realizing it belonged to the sheriff's father. The headlines wrote themselves, "HOA president targets wrong family. Sheriff's father's home destroyed in HOA dispute. Lakefront dream home torched by HOA." Patricia's face was on the front page of the county paper the day after her sentencing, being led away in handcuffs. The photographer captured her looking back at my father and me, a moment of realization too late to do her any good. The case became something of a local legend. "Remember when the HOA lady burned down the sheriff's dad's house?" Became shorthand for catastrophic misjudgment. Several national news outlets picked up the story, and a few months later, I was invited to speak at a conference about HOA reform. As I stood at the podium, I showed a single photo, my father sitting in his wheelchair, smiling on the porch of his rebuilt home, with the ashes of Patricia's career scattered like the remains of the house she destroyed. The audience erupted in applause, and one elderly gentleman shouted, "That's what I call justice." The case became a warning to HOAs across the state about the dangers of overreach and the importance of due process. It also became something of a legend in law enforcement circles, a reminder that behind the badge were real people with families who could be victimized just like anyone else. 2 years after the fire, Mike hosted a retirement celebration for his father at the rebuilt lake house. Friends, neighbors, and many of the people who had helped with the reconstruction gathered to honor Robert's recovery and resilience. As sheriff, I've spent my career upholding the law. As a son, I learned that justice sometimes requires rebuilding, not just punishment. Patricia Winters lost her freedom, but my father gained a stronger home and community. Robert, now fully recovered and enjoying his rebuilt dream house, had the final word. As Dad watched the new house near completion, he turned to me with a clarity I hadn't seen since before his heart attack. "Mike," he said, "Patricia thought she was destroying my dream, but she never understood what it really was. My dream wasn't just a house. It was leaving something behind that stood for justice, integrity, and family, just like you do every day with that badge." He pointed to the new timber frame rising against the lake. "That's something no fire can ever take away."